Welcome back to the crafting guide. I'm not gonna do an intro for the whole thing the second time around, that's in episode 1, but I want to note a few things about the next two nations in the beginning because of some similarities and good comparisons they have. Both Soviet and Brit are quite elite heavy, not just in the sense that they have a bunch of good ones, but also in the sense that you could easily find yourself needing a good chunk. Sometimes I start building a Brit control deck and have 12 elites in before I realize it, and that's about as expensive as a good cards deck can get. Now there are some cheap solid Soviet decks like tokens or self-damage which you can look up in detail, but those are quite specific, so not many replacements can be made. Meaning even though you don't need a bunch of elite and special wildcards for those, you would still need a lot of wildcards. And that's not something you can afford in the first couple of weeks. Having a solid Soviet deck is more like an achievable goal for your early cards career, requiring saving up a bunch and not something you almost start with. Also, even though self-damage is cheap, it's not as cheap as tokens, and the needed playstyle isn't very new player friendly either. But playing Brits on a budget is just a pain. Still, Soviet and Brit are the two notable mains for control and excellent allies as well. Brit also pairs well with ramp, but all these archetypes are quite expensive, to the point that I don't recommend sinking resources into these early on. But if you want to play control, Brit will start to look better with just 2 or so elites. The point I wanted to make isn't that this episode is a teaser, but I recommend taking a bit of a break from Soviet and Brit main play after getting the first 12 levels or so, and piling up some resources before getting really back into it. Like having a pile of the more common wildcards for Soviet and for Brits. If you happen to open some of the top elites from this list or saved up some elite wildcards to round it out, then comes the time when you could get into them more and into control for that matter. But it is a bummer that there is no control I could recommend for people just starting out. Then again, the situation isn't terrible and it's not a bad idea to see what you'd want to play control against first. Also, the needs for Brit, control and ramp overlap a lot, so you'd be working towards both goals at the same time. So this episode isn't just a look at the good stuff, but also a gauge of the needs to serve as a warning before one would start to really spend. But let's get into Soviets first. Elites. Soviets have a bunch of really good elites, some are flexible, some are basically just for control. First one is Korsun. Improves any Soviet deck and it might be in the league of its own. It's also the point where I'd feel good about a tokens deck elite-wise. There might be a couple more that you'd want to put in, but nothing that impactful. The second is BM13 or Big Catty, slots in pretty much everywhere nicely. The third is KV1, it's the win con in some Soviet decks, and even in other ones, it's good to have it as an extra help. The fourth would be the Engineers or Pervert. It pains to put it this low. It is arguably the best heal in the game, and for purely control purposes I'd put it up second, maybe first. It is up there in the needs for self-damage and so on, but not all prominent Soviet decks need healing, for example tokens and hyper aggro. So I pushed it lower because of this in this fierce competition. Fifth, Great Patriotic War. It's an improvement to most sensible and honest chunk of meme decks as well, and one might have a good reason to put it into the other ones. This is also an important benchmark, as the deck is solid with a couple less elites, but this is the point where it starts to get close to peak. 39th Rifle Regiment, or Big Brother. This is a great card, and you can put it into pretty much any Soviet deck, but Soviet has so many great elites and really specific synergies that I do occasionally find myself cutting it from high-end lists because of certain needs. But if you happen to have this card and you lack many others, then you could just chug it in. But this does push it up lower, especially if you are talking about crafting something. 272nd Cards. This might seem low to some, and in some sense it is. If I were to make a pure control ranking, then 272nd would probably be second or third. It's one of the main wincons for that deck archetype, while being a bit of a card as well. But this is a crafting guide and not a pure power ranking. The first part of the issue is flexibility. Other than control, it's only key in a possible and specific meme printer. Although in lower ranks, you could climb a bit just by chucking this card into any Soviet deck you have. But that won't be the case for long. The second part of the issue is the price of Soviet control. It's not good on a budget, and if you need a handful of elites for it anyways, there is no point in rushing this one in particular. That said, it's a really good card, but it can wait as far as crafting go. Yak7 would be the 8th in this list. This is a really good row, making it great in aggro and OTK. It has excellent synergy with self-damage. If you are mainly interested in that deck, I'd bump it up to 6 at the lowest. You might even consider EX7 for control. It is this low mainly because it's a bit off in tokens, and there are a lot of great Soviet elites, many of which is mainly for control. And honorable mentions. The common thread here is that they're great, but pretty much only for control. Armored Train, Depths of Winter, ISU 152, Naval Brigade. And honestly, I wouldn't leave many of these out from a Soviet main control deck while still recommending it. As the old saying goes, Soviet control is a bunch of elites and duct tape. Now to specials. This is the point from which Soviet advice cannot be generic anymore. Because of that, I'll provide short lists per archetype, but these archetypes are ordered by how affordable they are. For tokens, Baranovichi is first, obviously, and the second is close combat, although it's not that close. For self-damage, note that unless you run the more budget Brit Elite version, the draw of this archetype comes from Japan Specials. So if you're thinking about spending Universal Specials on this archetype, that's the priority. But, you know, we are talking about Soviet Specials here. And amongst those, the first would be T80, the second would be Petlyakov, and the third would be 5-year plan for a single copy. I think 2 of that is a bit of an overkill. For generic aggro, now aggro in general still isn't that expensive, but Soviet aggro isn't that strong, meaning you can't budget it that well, or you can't budget it that much. And that's why I put it lower, and that's why it's relatively more costly. First would be close combat, because Soviet main aggro is a bit of an infantry spam, and it feels that Blitzkrieg roll quite well here. And the second would be 5-year plan for both copies here, because aggro is a thirsty bitch. For push, the recommended special is push, and that's all. On the Soviet side. For control, the first would be By the Sword, second would be Petlyakov, and the third would be Chaika. You get one of the Chaikas from early levels, so only craft one. Note that both By the Sword and 5-year plan are quite good draws. If your deck has Soviet spots and draw issues, one of these is probably the solution, or at least part of it. Generally speaking, 5-year plan fits in with aggressive and some gimmicky stuff better, like self-damage or push, while By the Sword is more for control. Meaning that currently 5-year plan is the closest of any Soviet special to be recommended as something you generally want, but it's still just a bit short of that overall first spot, because I don't think it can be given, given how branched Soviet play is. For limited and standards, I'd recommend you look up particular decks you're interested in, because it just branches out way too much. And I'm not gonna go over every viable Soviet archetype in detail in this video. I will, however, put my non-budget self-damage tokens lists into the description for reference. But be careful as far as crafting goes, as a significant portion of those decks are fixed rewards you get by level 12. Also, I want to point out that Soviet have excellent cheap removal, some of which you get on the early levels. So for crafting, I could recommend Hammer from the limited side. You get one of these early on. I would craft one more. 3 would be a bit overkill. And on the standard side, Red Dawn and 52k. I wouldn't craft more than 252k, but those are quite useful cards. And here comes the Britter times. Elite, sincerely yours. Arguably the best draw in the game, and every deck needs some draw. Come on, Valve. This might look a bit high, but for most of the reasonable Brit decks, this is the primary or secondary win con. So this card is really important in making Britain playable. You don't need much more expensive cards to start playing Bit Control with some solid results, even if really high-end ones are far away. And this explains its crafting priority. Third, 85th Pioneer. Brit decks generally use a lot of orders, and this discount comes in huge. Sexton, it's great, and not just because of the name. It improves on pretty much every Brit deck I can think of and has at least a solid upside. 5th would be Wellington, 6th Ultra. These all improve pretty much every Brit deck. 7 would be Spitfire MK2A. Now, if you are aiming for a ramp deck, you should push this a spot or two lower on the list, but it's a generally good card. The issue is that the next card, Lancaster, improves much more on ramp and control, while Spitfire is more of a flex card in ramp. But I'll give Spitfire a slight overcrafting edge because of Brit Air, etc. flexibility. Lancaster B3. Unlike the previous ones, adding this wouldn't be an improvement on pretty much any Brit deck. It's only for control and ramp, but it's really good in those two, and those two are the main Brit decks right now. 9. Co-Belligerents. Similarly to Lancaster, this is only for control and ramp, but this card is huge as it helps a lot with the main Brit shortcoming, single target removal. Honorable mentions. HMS Illustrious. It's awesome, but only in Brit Air, which is FM capable, but not much more. Churchill. It's a really good card, mostly for control and ramp, but it's in a flex spot in high-end decks and comes and goes with the meta these decks aim to counter. For now, I'd say it's in control. Mosquito. It's one of those when in doubt chuck it in cards, but it can be suboptimal and certainly not the card that would make a deck pop. Still, it's good enough to mention. Specials. There are some solid Brit specials that are good in particular decks, but I'd say none of these are must-haves. Not only Brits are surprisingly light on specials, you do get at least a copy of some of the really good ones in the first 12 Brit levels, like Carpet or Ref. So I would generally hold on British special crafting until later, and I wouldn't use universal white cards on it. But I will note some. First would be Crusaider. It's a solid draw engine for Brit main decks. Honorable mentions would be Second Para. This is good in Brit Air deck variants, etc. Those are generally a bit expensive, but they do have FM upside, even though they don't really have a competitive one. Grenadier Guards. This is a solid big guard that could be good in control for a copy. You could use 2 copies in ramp, but it's not a must. Enemy Contact is a really good pin card, but pin only shines in some really specific decks like push, so it doesn't have the flexibility needed for an early craft. And here I want to place the Halifax warning. It is a popular card in ramp, Brit main or ally, because of the bomber end call and the obvious synergy with that. I've been tempted many times to put it in places, but that might be a mistake. It seems to be too greedy. More than likely those Brit Elites and the US special help is enough as far as finishing games go, and your spots are better used elsewhere. Now this does not mean that Halifax is terrible, but it does not seem to be a worthy craft. Now I and some other competitive players might be wrong and it might be a slight improvement, but even that's a narrow use case and a marginal gain. So I would just wait with it and try it out in case of opening. Only craft it if you are really into ramp and you are in the stage of collecting cards when you don't mind some potential waste. Or to put it a bit differently, even if someone is interested in ramp, I wouldn't recommend crafting Halifax until you have the key US specials, Warp Road and B17, a bunch of the Brit Elites and so on and so forth. It wouldn't work well until you are Lancaster deep into the British crafts anyway. In my experience, ramp doesn't work well on a budget and just outright selling pauper, so I would not rush crafting for ramp anyways, and even in that regard Halifax is really low on the list of things you want, and it's useless outside of ramp, so it's not a card you would generally want. It might work for some really specific thing, but unless you have almost everything else, I wouldn't bother. Now for limiteds, Honey is great. One of the really good cheap Brit units, well worth the craft for the whole set. Monsoon, this is a good tool for most Brit decks and widely hated in some part of the community because of that. But it's good craft for a copy or two. The chunkier the deck is, the more it can take. I wouldn't craft 3 unless the wild cards are really burning your pocket. Putting a full set of this into a deck would rarely be worth it. Not that fast decks wouldn't want any at all, but that's rarely a deck you'd go to the Brits for. Standards, Convoy. Every deck needs draw, and this is a good one, but you will get 2 copies of it early on, so you only need 2 more to have a full set. The second is Glamour, boys. Honestly, this card is a bit OP. It's one of the best cards in the game right now and the best standard by far. You can put it into any deck that needs a guard and it will do some good work. I've only put it behind Convoy in this guide because not all decks need guards. Supply shortage. This is one of the best board clears in the game. Crafting a full set is well worth it for control and ramp, which are the 2 strongest Brit decks at the moment. But even in decks like Push, Air or RT, you could use 2, and they will do great work. Honorable mentions. Humber. Although the card itself is not that flexible, it's really good in one of the best German main budget decks, so you might want it because of that. Fortification. This is a really solid basic heal card, but because how broken Glamour boys are, it's not as important right now as it used to be. Still, crafting 2 could be well worth it for many decks. And with this, we've reached the end of part 2, thankfully, because my voice is starting to go for no reason. Thank you for watching, subbing, liking and all that good stuff if you did. A bare list of this will be in the description, so you'll have an easier time checking back on what to craft later. See you in the next video about Japans, miners and goodbyes in about a week. I hope I can get it out in time.